me. Yep. I want to speak on this day, and that's what.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming to what I think will be a fascinating, if not entirely cheerful, panel on global risk, of which there is an abundance, and the challenges for the next president. Briefly, to set the stage, well, I'll say I'm Michael Crowley, and I write about foreign affairs for Politico in Washington, D.C. And you don't need to be reading Foreign Affairs magazine to understand that the next president, he or she, will inherit an enormous amount of risk. Vladimir Putin is ornery, unpredictable, and armed with nuclear weapons. Even by its own standards, the Middle East is a mess, along with North Africa, from Syria to Iraq to Libya to Yemen, not to mention an economically unshackled Iran after the nuclear deal. China is territorially aggressive and at the same time economically vulnerable, even as it develops ever more sophisticated cyber weapons, which we are still trying to understand. And in recent months, Europe, which we had long seen more as a partner than a problem, has begun to stagger under the pressures of terrorism, nationalism, continued economic stagnation, and potentially even splintering with the possible disintegration of the European Union. So this panel will assess these risks with a particular eye toward the future, looking forward to what the next president can and should do to bring more stability and security to the world at a time of limits on American power. So a brief introduction of our panelists, and we'll get started. Jane Harman, to my far left, is president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. She served 9 terms as a U.S. representative from California's 36th Congressional District, not far from here, and was ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. Niall Ferguson, thank you, is a professor of history at Harvard University and a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He is founder and managing director of the advisory firm Greenmantle, LLC, and the author of 14 books, most recently the first volume of his biography of Henry Kissinger. To my right, Senator Bob Corker, the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a U.S. senator from Tennessee since 2007. And at the end, Wesley Clark, a retired Army general, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe, now chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark and Associates.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. I thought we would start with Europe, partly because I have it on the brain. I was in London last weekend, where President Obama visited to plead with Great Britain to oppose the upcoming referendum on leaving the European Union in June. The message seemed to go over well. David Cameron and the anti-Brexit forces were buoyed by the president's call. And in Germany, President Obama gave an optimistic speech about the importance of European unity, in which he concluded that the bonds that hold Europe together are stronger than the forces pulling it apart. Niall, as someone who's written extensively about European history and conflict, and the resident European on our stage, do you buy it?
Well, I thought I'd say some controversial things this afternoon, and I'll begin with, I agree with President Obama, which is, I think, the first time I've ever said that publicly. I think he's very right that the notion of Britain's voting to leave the European Union is a dangerous one. I think he was right to point out the major economic risks that Britain would run in doing that. I want to warn that this is really still quite a plausible scenario. The polls are tight. There are only really a few percentage points separating Remain and Leave. And although it's, of course, easy to assume that on the day when we vote in June, people will vote for the safer option and Remain will win. I think that's the more likely scenario, but only just. And I think part of the reason why it's a close thing is that so much has been going wrong in Europe, whether you think of terrorist attacks in Paris and Brussels, the mass migration crisis that is ongoing, or the rise of populist parties and indeed the advent of populist governments in EU member states. many English viewers, and I stress English because I think the Scots will vote to remain, but many English viewers of TV look at what is happening on the continent and say, get me out of here. And so the arguments for leaving, although economically they really don't seem to make much sense, strike a chord with voters who are in a mood somewhat similar to the mood of American voters attracted to Donald Trump. So this is a kind of Trumpish moment. And there's even a British Trump named Boris Johnson,
right,
who has the same hairstyle and a somewhat similar approach to political discourse. Which is to say improvised with shots of populism. This is the moment in Britain, and I think it's a dangerous one, not just in terms of the EU, but in terms of Western unity. The whole concept of the West is being called into question this year, and if Britain takes the risk of voting to leave the EU, that will be a major blow for the idea of the West.
And just one more beat before we bring in the others. What about the president's assertion that the bonds holding Europe together are stronger than the ones pulling it apart? Do you think that's a fundamentally safe and uncontroversial assertion to make right now?
I would love to believe that that was self-evident. I think in Germany it's true in the sense that for Germany, the history of the last 100 years has pointed towards European integration as the best solution to the German question. And so although there are populists in Germany, most recently Alternative für Deutschland, it's unlikely that they're ever going to get anywhere close to political power. And there's a kind of natural grand coalition of moderate left and moderate right which governs Germany, and Angela Merkel in some ways personifies that. But if you look at the rest of Europe, it's a somewhat different story, because in some East European countries, notably Hungary and Poland, you have populists in power. The Austrians might be about to vote a populist into power. And so it's really outside Germany that Euroscepticism is a serious threat.
General Clark, I have to go to you because of your time at NATO, and let's spin the ball in more of a security direction now. Even as Europe is trying to figure out its own identity and its economic bonds, there's a question about European security, what NATO should look like, what role it should play. Now, when you were leading NATO, it was on the verge of cooperation with Russia. Now we have a very different relationship. What do you think, since we're talking here about challenges for the next president, what would you like to see the next president do in terms of NATO, European security, and responding to Vladimir Putin in Europe?
Yeah. Well, I think that the next president's going to have to face the issue of NATO rejuvenation, so to speak. They started that process at the summit in Wales in 2014, but much of the Cold War deterrent architecture has decayed. So, for example, you'd like to say if there's a threat to Poland, well, you just move some equipment in Poland, but you can't, because the road and rail movement procedures that were in place in Germany during the Cold War are not in place getting from Germany to Poland. You have an additional problem. You have Kaliningrad with an SA-300, 400 system there that covers half of Polish airspace and all of the Baltic approaches and half of Sweden. So if you're to reinforce the Baltics during a crisis, you're flying through something that will cut you off. So the first act of a defensive alliance would be to attack Kaliningrad. Hard to conceive. So we've got to really think this thing through. We've got another problem with Europe, and that is that Vladimir Putin has been tossing around casual references to nuclear weapons. Now, one of NATO's greatest crises was in the late 70s and early 80s when we had to confront nuclear modernization. It almost brought the alliance to its knees, and finally in the Reagan administration we got the so-called 0-0 option, which got rid of the SS-20 missiles. But that was a really tough process for NATO to go through. I'm told at the unclassed level, and there may be people here who know more than I do, but unclassed dialogue between Russian and American nuclear physicists in the late 1990s said that the Russians moved ahead with research on third and fourth generation nuclear weapons, that is neutron bombs, with the idea of making a usable battlefield nuclear weapon. So when Vladimir Putin talks about being able and runs in exercises that would use a nuclear response to de-escalate a conflict with NATO, what does that actually mean in terms of NATO deterrence? What we learned in the 70s and 80s is that you have to be able to match or overmatch for deterrent purposes at every level of escalation. If the United States can't match these battlefield nuclear weapons and would have to rely on a submarine-launched ballistic missile, do you still have deterrence? NATO is going to have to ask that question. It's going to be a very painful question. So the next president is going to have to deal with some important issues with respect to NATO.
Another very quick follow-up. We're seeing now Russian jets are buzzing our ships, causing near international incidents that are very dangerous. You could have a miscalculation. Do you worry about the possibility of an accidental escalation, that as we try to establish deterrence against Putin, we create a conflict through that process?
You know, there's always a possibility of an accidental escalation, but it's not going to happen by the United States. This is more about demonstrating Russia's power, and it intimidates not us, but our East European allies. And they respond by asking for more assurance from the United States. Give us more exercises, give us more presence. I was with the Georgians at the end of last week visiting in New York, and they want continuous NATO presence in Georgia because what Russia's doing is step by step encroaching on Georgian territory despite the 2008 ceasefire that was negotiated by President Sarkozy of France. It was never enforced. So every few weeks, the Russian soldiers go out and move the fence posts literally another 50 meters into Georgian territory. And so there seems to be no way to stop this. And so you're dealing with an air of intimidation across Eastern Europe. It affects the politics, it infects the investment climate, and it affects Europe's ability to come together and grow economically.
Let's stay with Putin and Russia for a couple more minutes. Senator Corker, thank you for joining us. And I won't ask you to answer for everything Donald Trump, who looks like the presumptive nominee of your party, has said. But the temptation is there. And one interesting thing Trump has said is that he suggested in his speech on foreign policy in Washington a few days ago, we ought to try to have better relations with Russia. He said, why do we have this escalating conflict? It would be so much better if we can get along. He did add that we have to do it from a position of strength. But how does that sound to you? Does that sound plausible, practical, something you would like to see the U.S. try to do, regardless of who our next president is?
You know, I listened to the speech as much as I could, and then read the pieces that I just didn't have time to stay and listen to. I was watching on television. I wasn't there. But I had to give a little bit of an attaboy after, the kinds of things that have been said during the course of the campaign. And what I heard, although maybe not fully, was sort of a return to the Bush 41 James Baker thinking. So, there's been a big neocon push in Washington since 2000. I think Wesley would agree to that. And what I heard was a sort of a realism, if you will, stepping in. Now, whether that's long held or whether that's something that was said that day in a speech that someone else wrote, I don't know. But there's no question. Wesley and I were talking before we came out. There are certainly areas where Russia certainly has the same issues we have. I mean, this issue of terrorism and extremism is even more critical to them in many ways than to us. So I think there are some areas where we could work with them. What's happened, unfortunately, is out of lack of strength, especially what happened in August and September of 2013, I don't think Russia feels that America will act out of strength, and basically what's happening in Syria now is going to be totally settled on Russia's terms. And so that arrangement has got to alter for us to have any reasonable chance of having a healthy relationship with them.
Jane Harman, do you want to weigh in on Russia and Europe, or I would turn to the Middle East, unless you want to chime in on this?
I do. I want to weigh in on Brexit first, because
Go ahead.
To quote Donald Rumsfeld, there are some known unknowns. And two of them are that there will be, in my view, another terror attack in Europe somewhere. And if that happens before the election, the Brexit election, I think that will have a direct impact. The other is The impact of refugees. There already are 1 million refugees. Some have been sent back now. Most of them are being blocked. But that is a huge lead sinker around the EU. And I think that will influence voters in Britain. I hope they make the right decision. I agree with Neil Ferguson and Barack Obama that the right decision is to stay in the European Union. On Russia, to quote Henry Kissinger, whom Neil knows a lot about and I serve with on the Defense Policy Board, where do we want this to end up? And that's the question he asked. We don't want to end up in a war with Russia, certainly in a land war with Russia in Europe. That's why he counseled against providing the Ukrainians with lethal defensive arms, because he said we're playing to Russia's advantage. Our asymmetric strength, obviously, is our economy against their imploding economy. And so using sanctions adroitly and hanging tough with Europe, it seems to me, positions us in a much better place than tit for tat.
You oppose sending lethal arms to the Ukrainians.
Well, I'm quoting Henry. I thought it was a very close case.
Yeah.
And looking at how Ukraine is turning out, sadly, and seeing the rampant corruption that is still there, for which young people fought, against which young people fought bravely in the Maidan and Kyiv, it's a tragedy. Ukraine is a tragedy, and it has been destabilized by Russia, but it hasn't, despite IMF help and some olive branch from Europe and us, it isn't getting well, and that's a real problem.
Because in the spirit of robust debate, Senator Corker, I believe you support, correct me if I'm mistaken, sending lethal arms to the Ukrainians? Or would you disagree with that proposition that it's not the right U.S. policy? And that
No, I felt very strongly that we should help with lethal weaponry. I thought sending night goggles that didn't work was not really much assistance to them. Or sending rations that no one would eat with much assistance to them. So I was even more discouraged by the fact that we wouldn't even provide them with intelligence as to where the Russians were operating in eastern Ukraine, because we didn't want to feel, the president didn't want it to feel that we were operational in the effort. So I think our support of them has been tepid. There's no question there are issues of corruption. There's no question that right now they are as big of an enemy to themselves as Russia is. I mean, there's issues that have to be resolved there. But I did not think that our support of them was to the level that it should have been at the time.
And I agree with that. I agree with that.
Okay.
The issue was arms, but certainly providing surveillance photos of the little green men, a.k.a. Russians, coming across the border, and the pre-positioning of equipment was the right thing to do, and we did not do it.
And then, I mean, that was the most terse conversation I think I've had with President Obama, was the unbelievable lack of willingness for us to share with them where the Russians were operating in eastern Ukraine, again, because Russia would feel that we were becoming operational. That, to me, showed a real lack of commitment to Ukraine as a country.
Quickly, one more beat on this because it's interesting. And General Clark, you spent a lot of time, again, as we just discussed, thinking about escalation. President Obama's position is if we send lethal arms to the Ukrainians, Putin will simply escalate, and he will always escalate one step farther than we will. The conflict will get worse, but he will always have the upper hand. He simply cares more about Ukraine than we ever realistically will. Where do you come down on this question of our support for the Ukrainian military?
Oh, I would have put defensive arms in, but I probably would have done it in such a way that you had packaged it up and able to ship it in if he violated some norm. The truth is that, according to my Ukrainian sources, Putin told Russian General Gerasimov to clear Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, to the oblast boundaries of Donbass by the 1st of February. And the Ukrainians didn't budge. Now, there was a big battle in February of 2015 at Debaltseve, this train junction. And every other day, Putin was calling Poroshenko and saying, I'm going to destroy your army if you don't surrender right now. And so it was a strategic contest between heads of state. And the Ukrainians stayed there until they burned up the barrels of their artillery. They were literally firing 600 rounds a day per artillery tube. The Poles had the artillery tubes to resupply them, and either we or the Germans basically said, don't do it. So we left them hanging in a position that I wouldn't have wanted to do that. But I give a lot of credit to the Ukrainians. They were tough. They were strong. They took a lot of criticism. And I guess even worse than the issue of the defensive weapons is the issue of the Minsk agreements. You know, it's been a principle since the end of the Cold War that when you're dealing with a nuclear power, you don't let the Europeans take the lead in dealing with a nuclear-armed Russia. So we basically told Germany, you take the lead, you sort this out, and nobody could be more conflicted about this than Germany.
Right.
Ukraine's a potential economic competitor in heavy industry, and Germany has big economic interests with Russia. So I think Poroshenko did a brilliant job in holding it together, but it's not done. I mean, you've got corruption, you've got elections, you've got economics, and they're still losing 2, 3, 4 Ukrainian soldiers per day. It's at any time that Russia chooses, it can surge the forces in and try to punch the hole. And we've done some training, we've done some leadership development, but when it comes to the anti-tank weapon that defeats the T-90 tank, the precision anti-aircraft that defeats the drone, we don't have that in there yet, and the Ukrainians don't have it.
Neil, let me just go to you again before we change gears to the Middle East on this, because it's such an interesting question. So again, we're thinking about the next president, him or her, Vladimir Putin. You know, one theory of Putin is that he's kind of a caged animal. Oil prices are down, his economy is struggling, and he's lashing out without a strategy. It's tactical. He seems good at causing trouble. There's a version of him that sees more grand strategic designs, trying to reshuffle Europe, change the nature of Russian power on the global stage. What would you like to see the next president do? Which interpretation would you recommend, or maybe another interpretation for the next American president? What would you like to see that president do in dealing with Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think the first thing is let's try to apply history. In January 2014, President Obama said in an interview in the New Yorker that he didn't really need George Kennan, or by implication any expert on international relations. He had this covered with his own great mind. And just a few weeks later, Crimea was annexed, and in violation of international law, in violation of the Budapest Agreement, and the war was launched in eastern Ukraine that General Clark so eloquently described. And this, I think, came from a fundamental failure to understand Putin. And I think the next president has to do a much better job of understanding what Russia is about. This is one of the themes of the Kissinger biography, that you really have to realize that history is to nations what character is to individuals. If you just are dismissive of Russian history, you don't get what it is that Putin's trying to do. You're right, Michael. He is in a weak position. He's been in a weak position, actually, since the Yanukovych regime was overthrown by revolution in Kiev. And the weakness was compounded by the crash in oil prices. Right. But he sure does know how to play a weak hand. We haven't even got to the Middle East yet, but almost as significant, maybe more significant, has been the Russian intervention in Syria.
Yep.
One of Henry Kissinger's great achievements was to completely exclude the Soviets from the Middle East in the 1970s, to remove them as players. Yep. Well, they're back. And they're back because we dropped our guard and we didn't realize what it was that Putin was looking for. He was looking for an in. And he got one. And by the way, the consequences of that in have been disastrous for the people of Syria. The body count soared the minute the Russians intervened because of their indiscriminate use of very serious air power. So the next president has to do much better than this president has. If the next president is Donald Trump, I do not expect that to be the case. And I really hope that the headline after this panel is not Milken panel says attaboy to Donald Trump. Because I feel, having read carefully the recent foreign policy speech, anything but reassured, with all due respect to the senator. This was one of those speeches which contains 50% sense to lull you into agreement, and 50% of the speech was critical in reasonable ways of failures of the Obama administration's and the Bush administration's foreign policies. But when you look at the other 50%, it still implies trade war with China, and it still implies a fundamental questioning of NATO itself. And crucially, it implies a great deal with Russia. Donald Trump is itching to be in Moscow doing the deal of a lifetime with his kindred spirit, another would-be tyrant, Vladimir Putin. Nothing makes my blood chill more than the thought of Trump and Putin doing a deal. Just ask yourself.
I think we know where you're coming from. Jane wanted to jump in on that.
I did. At the Wilson Center, we have the Kennan Institute on Russia. And Kennan's long telegram said, among other brilliant things, that Russia plays the long game. Russia is playing the long game, and Vladimir Putin is playing a long game with a weak economy, but a strong strategic hand. He knows what he's doing. You don't have to like it in Ukraine and in Syria. And we created a vacuum because we play the short game that he is filling. And, oh, by the way, China's filling some of that vacuum, too, in the South and East China Seas, and maybe in the future in other places. The challenge for the next president, whoever she may be, is to figure out how to play the long game, how to create a strategic, not just a tactical narrative, a strategic narrative about what U.S. values and interests are around the world. No one understands that at the moment, and we're not feared or respected as we should be because that isn't out there.
So, by the way, can I just add one thought?
Yep.
It's pretty clear what deal the Russians would like to do because they've tried to do it with President Obama on at least 2 occasions. And it's a deal that would essentially lop a chunk of eastern Ukraine off permanently, recognize permanently the annexation of Crimea, and leave the Russians in a permanent strategic position in Syria. Now, that kind of deal is the kind of deal that I dread President Trump, quote unquote, doing, because it would be a deal at the expense not just of Ukraine and Syria, but it would be a deal at the expense of the integrity of Western leadership. That is what is so dangerous. Read that speech carefully and picture the great deal that Donald Trump wants to do in Moscow.
Okay, we're at about the halfway point, so let's pump the brakes, turn to the Middle East. Senator Corker, I know you've been to the region not long ago. We'll come to you in a moment, but I want to put this question to Jane Harman. And I guess the question here is, talk about what the United States can constructively and productively do in the Middle East. One of President Obama's recurring themes, and anyone who read his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg heard this loud and clear, President Obama feels like there are real limits to what the United States can accomplish without making problems worse. And I want to quote for you what I think is one of the great, whatever you think of it, one of the great quotes of the last few years. It's from Philip Gordon, who was a former director for the Middle East at the National Security Council. He said, "When implying the United States can fix Middle Eastern problems if only it gets it right, it is worth considering this. In Iraq, the U.S. intervened and occupied, and the result was a costly disaster. In Libya, the U.S. intervened and did not occupy, and the result was a costly disaster. In Syria, the U.S. neither intervened nor occupied, and the result is a costly disaster. This record is worth keeping in mind as we contemplate proposed solutions going forward." Jane, you and I were talking backstage about how Iraq, even by its own standards, is in a state of political turmoil. The government is in deep trouble there. That is bad news for the fight against ISIS. We've been trying to stand up a government in Iraq for years. We've been trying to train the Iraqi security forces. This does seem like an example of the limits of our ability to shape these terrible situations. What can the next president do?
Well, let me start with my mea culpa. I voted for the war in Iraq because I believed the intelligence, which I read carefully. The intelligence was wrong, my vote was wrong, and looking back on that, I think that will be the biggest strategic blunder, at least of the first part of the 21st century, and a lot follows from that. We mishandled how we would prosecute the war once we went there, and we misread 2 governments in Iraq. The present one may fall any day now. because a body doesn't seem to have enough capacity to hold the different factions of Iraq together. Vice President Biden went there a few days ago, and I know he was trying to moderate the Kurds against the Shias and the Sunnis there, but I don't know whether this will stick together. What can we do? Just because it's hard doesn't mean we should take our marbles and go home. Remember Kennedy's wonderful quote about the space, about the space mission. We will do it because it's hard. And we must stay in the Middle East regardless of how hard it is, because we have strategic interests there, especially to protect our democratic ally, Israel. But in addition to that, I think we have an obligation for two reasons to this huge ballooning Arab population. One reason is the moral obligation, which is obvious. The second reason is if we don't do it, a whole bunch of these folks will join this radical Islam movement and attack the West, including us. So for all those reasons, we have to figure out the hard things, put them together, weave a strategic narrative, and I do think that is going to be an imperative challenge for the next president, and I would hope President Obama would stick it out and try to find better answers in his last 9 months as president.
Senator Corker, what do you think, and what are you hearing from leaders in the region who you visit? It seems like a familiar refrain now that America has stepped back, they say, not showing a strong enough leadership role. But what about that kind of trifecta of bad outcomes that I just recited from Phil Gordon? Doesn't that tell us that, isn't that a kind of a warning that we just can't seem to get it right in this region, and maybe we're better off following the president's course of mitigating our risk and treading with a lighter footprint?
I'll go back to what I said earlier about Bush 41, and I think there's a realism that needs to creep back into our foreign policy, and a realization that America cannot, with its military, go into a country and all of a sudden transform it into a democracy. And I look at what we did in Egypt, where basically we threw a long-term friend overboard like that. And then all of a sudden, when Sisi came in, we cut off military aid. I just don't think that we think through our policies in the way that we should. I was opposed to us hitting Libya. I mean, here we have someone who's given up their nuclear weapons. So we send a signal to the world, you give up your nuclear weapons and we will take you out. So I just think that, again, there's a realism that needs to creep back into our foreign policy. I'm glad to see that those discussions are taking place. In Syria, again, we first of all said there was a red line, and then we didn't enforce it. We jumped in Putin's lap, and basically that was the beginning of him taking some really bad cards and playing them well throughout the region, including the destabilizing of Europe, because he realized that we would not take action. But in addition to that, we had the moderate groups there that we were working with. We told them what we were going to do, and we never did it. So, look, I think there was a way for Syria to work out in a much better way than it did without us invading. And I think, just step back, I mean, Egypt, you look at the Middle East, each of the countries has these phenomenal problems, 40% unemployment rate for youth. You've got the Wahhabism that's taken hold with clerics. This is an issue that's going to be with us for 20, 30, 40 years. Egypt alone has 90 million people, 2.5 million new people being born each year. 700,000 jobs have to be created each year just to keep them employed. They need 24,000 classrooms right now. They have terrorism in the Sinai. Tourism is down because of the issue with the plane crashing. So, I mean, you look at that, and then we have leaders that come in and out, some of whom we trust, some of whom we don't. The Middle East is going to be a significant problem for the world for decades, and we again have to be realistic in our approach and realistic as to what U.S. leadership can mean in the region, but we still have to be involved.
General Clark, he's calling for a return to a kind of realism. When you were commander at NATO, the U.S. intervened in the Balkans. It was, I don't know if you would call it idealism, but it was not realism. It was interventionism. and a belief that American power could shape these outcomes for the better. Do the risks of the Middle East demand more American intervention than President Obama has been willing to apply? And what would you like to see the next president, what sort of strategy would you like to see the next president pursue?
Well, I think you bring up the Balkans. Let's go back and learn the lesson. The lesson from the Balkans was that we tried for a long time to get that conflict stopped. We put the UN in. We had a NATO mission in the Adriatic. We shot down a couple of Serb aircraft. We did a bombing campaign. It wasn't until the Croatians built their armed forces, they attacked. The Serbs realized that time wasn't on their side. Milosevic realized that he was losing strategically, that we could then realistically negotiate an agreement. What you have in the Middle East is multiple conflicts going on with parties who, they basically like it because the situation that's going on is better for them now with the opportunities than a complete cessation of hostilities. Who am I talking about? Iran. Iran is working very hard to grab total control through Iraq into Syria and within Lebanon so it can fulfill its ideological mission of pressuring Israel. Turkey. President Erdogan believes that Turkey should have an ethical foreign policy that reflects its historic leadership in the Islamic world. What are the limits on that? Does he want to take Mecca again? Some of my friends in Saudi Arabia say, we don't understand what he wants. Maybe he does. He certainly doesn't want to be encircled by Iran. And of course, you have the Kurds. They want their own state. Anytime Turkey opposes Iran, Iran stimulates the Kurds attack Turkey, Turkey attacks the Kurds. It's a stew pot. And the United States can't solve this by putting a bunch of 19-year-old GIs in there who can't speak the language, don't understand the culture, and rotate through. It's like someone said about Afghanistan. We had 10 different or 12 different, 13 different one-year missions in Afghanistan, but we haven't actually been there the whole time. And the same was true in Iraq. So you have to be realistic. This is an important area, as Jane said. We have vital interests. We must stay engaged. We must recognize what our own power can do. We've got to stop the killing. This is the most important thing I ever learned from Richard Holbrooke. Stop the killing. Let the diplomats argue. They love it. That's what they get paid for. But you must stop the killing. Now, there's been so much killing and slaughter in the Middle East that you're 2 to 3 generations away from peace there. So we have to be able to try to shape it from the outside. We have to support people who can bring stability. I happen to think, and with what Senator Corker was saying about Egypt, President Sisi's the guy there. I mean, you may not like his human rights policy. We may say, look, you're making a mistake. You're cracking down so hard, you're building up more enemies. But the alternative for the United States is exactly what? Right. Overthrow Sisi and then what? So you're dealing with lesser evils, and we have to be smart enough and nuanced enough in our foreign policy to do that.
So stop the killing. I think one thing Donald Trump, Neil, has tapped into is a sense among a lot of Americans that it's not our job to stop the killing in these countries that we don't know much about. Sarah Palin said, and I'm not endorsing the remark, but Sarah Palin, I think, spoke for more than a few Americans when she said, let Allah sort them out. So it's not our fight. Let them kill each other. You were asked by Barron's a few months ago if the United States should be the global cop. Global cop. Stop the killing. And you said someone's got to do it. So why does America need to do that? And can we, again, for the next president, trying to figure out what can we really do to mitigate risk in the Middle East? What can we do effectively without making the problem worse? Is there a way to do that?
Well, first of all, let's not forget that Donald Trump has said that he would annihilate Islamic State. He won't say how, because he makes a virtue of being unpredictable. But the idea that Donald Trump is not going to intervene in the Middle East seems contradicted by everything that he said on the subject of Islamic State. So that's point one. Point two, this concept of a global COP has a pretty respectable pedigree. It was Franklin Roosevelt who thought the UN Security Council should institutionalize 4 global policemen as permanent members at the very inception of the United Nations. And I argued in a book that was published more than a decade ago, Colossus, that the United States faced a dilemma. That the world requires some global policing. To use a fancy academic term, it needs a hegemon. But the United States finds it incredibly difficult to play that role because it's allergic to doing anything that smacks of imperialism. We don't do empire. That was a constant refrain even during the heyday of the neoconservatives. The problem is that if you do short-term interventions, you can have almost no chance of long-term stabilization of the countries that you're trying to influence. It's possible, because I have been, to be critical of both Bush's intervention in Iraq and Obama's non-intervention in Syria, and not reach the conclusion, oh, we can't do anything, we should just give up. Because I think the lesson of the Balkans, for example, was that there are things we can do that lie in between full-scale invasion and occupation and doing absolutely nothing beyond ineffectual airstrikes. Let me offer a simple insight based on the extraordinary Jeffrey Goldberg article based on interviews with the president that was just published a couple of weeks ago. What President Obama has done has been to turn our foreign policy on its head in the Middle East in ways that we haven't really touched on, because in that interview he makes it clear just how hostile he's become to our traditional allies in the region, including notably Israel and Saudi Arabia, and he's broadly wagered on a deal with Iran that represents a fundamental challenge to the security of those allies. Now, this is a very high-risk strategic experiment that is being run here. And my analysis has been that it will incentivize violence in the region. It incentivizes the Sunni states to protect themselves against an Iranian dominance of a post-American Middle East. So the status quo, our current policy, I am sure, is fueling a cycle of violence, an escalation of violence that can get a whole lot worse. I would say a reasonable position has been to think that if you thought this year was violent in the Middle East, just wait for next year. And that position has been true steadily since the Arab so-called spring. So we need a change of policy. This policy, the president's strategic inversion, I don't think is working. And I hope she, and I really do hope she is going to be the next president, I hope Hillary Clinton has a more coherent strategy for the region than this president has, because his has not worked.
Excuse me, Senator, you mentioned Iran, Senator Corker. You were at the center of the Iran nuclear deal debate. So I wanted to ask you, now that we're, I think it's maybe 9 months past this deal that was the focus of Washington for so long, and the entire region, do you see, does anything surprise you about the way the deal is playing out? Iran is complaining that it's not reaping the economic benefits it expected. Its behavior hasn't demonstrably changed, although perhaps it's pursuing status quo policies in places like Syria and Yemen. But also, what can the next president do to mitigate risk from Iran, including the possibility that Iran will develop a nuclear weapon?
Yeah. So it's I think, played out kind of like we thought it was going to play out, and that is that, you know, yes, some of the moderates have been elected. We had it was a good election in Iran from, I guess, U.S. perspective on Friday, and one a couple months ago. At the same time, what's happened is there's been no change in behavior whatsoever. As a matter of fact, what you have is a country that makes itself more appealing to the world by virtue of the things that it says, but it's doing as much or more of the things that it does. I think it's pretty incredible that on one hand, we're trying to make accommodation to them so that they can reap the economic benefits of the deal, and obviously that's Secretary Kerry saying to the foreign banks, go ahead and do business with Iran, it's okay, we're not going to challenge that. At the same time, Iran is continuing on the ballistic missile testing, not only to do it, but to do it in a way that we know is incredibly in the face, if you will, of Israel and candidly of us.
So that surprised you, that you,
no,
velocity that you weren't expecting with those tests?
Well, no, actually, during the hearing process, I said to Secretary Kerry, look, the language now says we call upon them not to do ballistic testing, but the old language was they shall not. I view this, they're going to view this as an opening. He says absolutely not. The fact is that it's played out the way, again, that we thought it would. So, again, what you have as a country, and back to what a president can do, a president can push back against that ballistic testing. A president can push back against the terrorism that is taking place in the region with additional resources. And a president can push back against the human rights record that they have within the country. A president can also work with our allies, and I think Neil's right. I mean, I think what you're seeing is people wanting to certainly defend themselves more fully. You could, in fact, have a greater destabilization, but I think, in fact, that we haven't agreed to sell F-16s to Qatar. We haven't agreed to sell them to Kuwait. We still have outstanding orders with Bahrain. I mean, we've got to follow through with the agreements that we've made, or at least the comments we've made relative to supporting our Sunni friends.
We may have a dissenting view. Is President Obama letting Iran trample over him?
Well, I supported the Iran deal because I thought, and I think, it takes one issue of bad behavior off the table. It doesn't take the rest of it off the table. I think that it will contain Iran's nuclear program for, count the years, 10 to 15, maybe to 20 years. But Iran still is engaging in bad behavior, and it has ramped up its missile testing. And the president pushed back by imposing additional sanctions, which was the right thing to do. And Congress wants to push back more. My view, it's the right thing to do.
And
Iran should not be rewarded in any way for this. And I think a failure to push back will create a huge additional push by the Sunni world to possibly develop nuclear weapons and to be much more aggressive against Shias. I mean, this clash, even leave Israel out of it, is becoming something that we did not anticipate. And I just wanted to make one other comment about Israel. We are negotiating arms deals with some of the Sunni states. We should also be calling on them to do their fair share with respect to refugees and actions in Syria and in favor of creating some peace deal there, if possible. But the point I was going to make is we're also trying to negotiate a long-term MOU with Israel, which we should be doing. It's stalled. That thing should go forward because Israel is the democracy in the Middle East that we need to protect.
Yeah, and it will.
Very quick thoughts. We're running low on time. Did you want to jump in? Did you want to jump in on this?
Well, I think the danger is that we end up talking about the Middle East in terms that are now completely anachronistic. There is no longer a Middle Eastern problem. The problem of Islamic extremism stretches right across North Africa. It's penetrating sub-Saharan Africa, extends right into South Asia. And of course, it's global in the sense that there are supporters of Islamic State on social media in this country, not to mention all over Europe. So part of our problem, I think, is that we're slightly stuck with the conceptual framework that is out of date. The word realism has been used a couple of times on this panel. I'm slightly skeptical about the value of that word. I came to realize right in the Kissinger biography that he himself wasn't at all a realist. In the Cold War, he saw communism as posing a fundamental threat to individual freedoms. That is what radical Islam does today, but we haven't yet seen the scale of the challenge that it poses, the scale of the challenge it poses to something as fundamental as the rights of women. You know, we think of feminism as having won great battles in the past 100 years, but it's actually in retreat all over the world where Islamists are getting the upper hand. So this is not just about realism. It is not just about saying what is the American national interest. This is a major ideological struggle as serious as the battles we fought in the 20th century against Nazism and against communism.
Thank you. General, I feel like President Obama, who spent years trying to pivot to Asia, I've been wanting to pivot to Asia from the Middle East, but we're bogged down in it. But I'm going to give General Clark a chance to weigh in, and then we'll talk about China in the remaining few minutes that we have.
So I think there is a problem with the way that the Islamic world is dealing with its faith. But I just want to put this point in. We're talking about the world and going around about global challenges. I think you've got to get to the economy, and we've only got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, please.
And I know this is mostly about the economy, and we're trying to cover the areas aren't. But you know, the Fed is maxed out. We're at the end of the period where you thought you could do everything by monetary policy alone, and we're in a classic liquidity trap. We're not creating the jobs either here or in Europe that we need, and our politics reflects that. And if you're looking at what the next president's got to worry about, he can't go on the formula of she cannot go on the formula of low interest rates, low inflation, more trade opportunities, and try not to raise taxes too much, because that's not getting to a large part of the American people. They're not getting the benefits from this. So we got to look at a different formulation. We got to stop thinking just about shareholder theory of value in the economy. We've got to look at stakeholder values in the economy. And we've got to do it in a constructive way that doesn't rip this society apart.
But the next president has, before she becomes president, to make a much more compelling case than so far has been made for free trade, for immigration as a source of strength for this country. We need to take on Trump's very sinister message that we have to bash the Chinese, build walls across the borders. We have to take that message on and explain to the American people that the problems that they've experienced in the last 16 years cannot all be blamed on foreigners, which right now is Donald Trump's.
Yes, but you must have a constructive policy to do it. And I'm not hearing that. I didn't hear it from Bernie Sanders, and it's not yet in the debate. Now, it may be there, and maybe there are some super secret economists who know how to restart this economy. But the next president, she has to do this.
Well, Senator Corker, let's talk. This is a nice transition to China. One reason President Obama has spent years saying that we need to, he actually didn't coin the phrase pivot to Asia. It was a headline writer, but it is now the de facto shorthand for his policy. His argument is this is the booming part of the world that the United States has to be spending more time on, has to have better relationships with. China obviously is at the core of it. But we have this geostrategic problem with China. It's not just an economic relationship. You said just last week, in reference to Chinese territorial claims, the Obama administration has no coherent policy on China's pursuit for total control in the South China Sea. So, mindful of the economic context here and the fact that it's not, it's quite different from the relationship with Russia, which does have an economic component, but it's not nearly as significant as it is when it comes to China. What kind of policy should the next U.S. president pursue toward China, particularly when it comes to these territorial issues, that doesn't trample on the economic relationship?
Yeah. Well, first of all, economically, I'll step back for a moment. There are some issues with the Trans-Pacific Partnership that need to be resolved, and they are real. Relative to our banking industries, relative to pharma, relative to some other things. But it is important for us to end up with an agreement relative to these partners that we've been working with for some time. Economically, that is very important for us. It's very important for them. Right now, China is pushing them towards us. If we don't end up with some type of agreement with them, China's going to make steps in negotiating their own agreement, which is very different in its nature. It's not about the free enterprise system we have. It's more towards state-owned enterprise, and it's going to state-owned enterprises, and it's going to increase their dominance. We are behind the curve relative to the territorial issues. We waited too long to become involved. But for instance, we've got the vast part of our naval fleet in that part of the world, and we can buzz within the 12-mile nautical area that we ought to be doing that on a weekly basis. I mean, we're doing it right now per the testimony last week, once a quarter, but we ought to be showing that this is not going to be an area that they are going to control. Yeah. And again, supporting things like we are right now, the tribunal that's occurring between the Philippines and China is very important. We'll see what happens with the outcome. But we waited way too long. Relative to our relationship with them, there's no question that it is the largest, most important relationship that we're going to have to manage over the next 30 to 40 to 50 years. It's important, but you cannot manage a relationship as long as you're allowing one of the partners to continue to step on you through cyber theft, through intellectual property theft, through antitrust laws against our own companies which are used for reasons really to destabilize their ability to operate. So we've got to push back both economically and militarily, not through taking military action, but making sure they understand they are not going to control the seaways that exist there.
I actually think President Obama is doing those things pretty well. First of all, he negotiated a trade agreement, surely not perfect, but he did it and he's pushing for it, which is a very hard thing for a Democrat to do.
I will give him credit on that.
And sadly, both Hillary Clinton and certainly the Sanders campaign are against TPP, and there is a huge wing of the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party that's anti-trade. That's one point. The second point is on the South China Sea, that had Congress ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty, which I think is a glaring omission. I don't know how you feel, Bob. I think we would have a stronger hand, but we're playing the hand we have. Ash Carter's been pretty aggressive, sending our frigates and others, through those waters, declaring that they are international
Once a quarter.
waters.
So
Once a quarter.
we're down to less than 2 minutes, very briefly, and then we're going to quickly run through something that you're worried about that we haven't talked about today.
Well, there's one lesson of history. Go back 100 years. Where were we? The rising power was at war with the incumbent power. And what we must avoid in the 21st century is a rerun of that, with China in the role of Germany and the United States in the role of Great Britain. We must ask ourselves at this election, which candidate is more likely to maintain a harmonious relationship with the second largest power in the world, and which is more likely to enter into conflict with it. And I know pretty clearly in my mind which candidate is which.
Okay, so we have a minute left. Everyone has time for about a sentence or two. Pandemics, climate, cyber, you name it, something that we didn't talk about or we didn't spend enough time on that you worry a lot about. Let's start with you, General Clark.
Sure, I'm worried about cyber, but I want to go back to the South China Sea because that's a critical flashpoint that's coming. When the International Court says that China doesn't have a right to build those launching pads and landing strips on the atolls, China's not going to say, oh, I'm so sorry. China's going to stay. So we will have weakened the International Court. So I'm of the school you got to get some trading material. Our trading material is some of those other atolls out there that the Philippines or Malaysia or somebody else can build up. And then we say to the Chinese, okay, we got our atolls, you got your atolls. Why don't we turn them over to the United Nations?
Thank you. Senator Corker, something you worry about, or if we're seconds left, we're over time.
Yeah. Our nation has become weaker while we are sitting here. And it is by far the greatest threat. There will be no U.S. foreign policy unless we deal with the fiscal issue that we have here as a nation. It is a threat to us. There's been a lack of courage and a lack of leadership to deal with this issue, and if we don't get it under control soon, all these things that we're talking about are going to be for naught.
Thank you, Neil.
Paradoxically, the biggest threat to international global stability today is U.S. domestic politics, and that is the thing I worry about most.
We lack an overarching strategic narrative for what the U.S. values and interests are around the world. And in the absence of that narrative, a vacuum has been created, and Russia and China are filling it.
Next president has an easy job, it sounds to me. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for a great conversation.